Okay, teachers, everybody, we're back at it. We're going to do TKES Standard 5 today, Assessment Strategies. But I do want to say I wanted to thank everybody who has either looked at the Flipgrid video or has looked at the Google Doc and made responses there. I think it's a good way for us to stay in touch. I'm really thinking about you guys, missing you guys, hoping these videos are giving you some normalcy, and I think I'm going to quit saying that. So I'll read the standard. The teacher systematically and consistently chooses a variety of diagnostic, formative, and summative assessment strategies and instruments that are valid and appropriate for the content and student population. I think this standard really boils down to, is the teacher intentional about how she is assessing students? That's really the big thing, and I'll probably finish with that as well when we get to the end. Each one of you I know is given assessments throughout the year. We give you assessments that you have to do, and also the state and the district office give you assessments. You need to mark those down in your plans or on your calendar, and you need to prepare for those. But those are not the assessments that I'm talking about this time. Those assessments are things like STAR, milestones, math matters. Those are the things that we're getting ready for, but those are not the standard, or not the assessment that this standard deals with. But it is, you can use some of those as standards for some of the things we're going to talk about. This standard deals with the assessments that we or you choose, and there's really three types. There's a diagnostic, and that's just kind of figuring out where the student is, what the student's doing, how the student learns best, those kinds of things. There are formative assessments. Those are assessments that you give along the way. They can be as simple as thumbs up, thumbs down. They can be talk to your neighbor. They're when you're using the boards. We give formative assessments standardized in 5th grade for science and social studies, but those are assessments that we give along the way to see if we're going to be ready at the end. And then you have summative assessments, and those are assessments at the end. They can be at the end of a chapter, they can be at the end of a unit, they can be at the end of the year, all of those things. So those are the three types of assessments we're going to talk about, and you have to plan and be ready and be intentional about giving all three types of those assessments. I think, and I personally believe, that you have to think backwards about them. So the way that I just mentioned them, we're going to talk about in reverse order. You first have to know what you're going to assess at the end. You kind of got to know where you're headed. You got to read the standards. You got to look at what you want. You got to figure out what you want the students to know by the end. And then you have to match an assessment to whether those students know what you taught. Next, you kind of really got to know if you're making progress towards the end game. And so if you're making progress, you use the formative assessments. Like I said, they're different types. You can use test as well as informal assessment, teacher observations, and all of those things. But really, you're figuring out whether students are going to be ready when they take that summative assessment. And then finally, the last thing you think about is, do you know where the students are? Do you know how they learn best? Do you know? And so you can give a diagnostic test. We use STAR as diagnostic, and that's what I meant by we would talk about it later. But it can be as easy as a pretest or a KWL chart as well. So you just have to be intentional about those three things when you are planning your instruction. Here's some things to think about when you're creating or choosing an assessment. Are you giving regular feedback to students? Is their feedback specific and timely? Are you using open-ended questions? Is the assessment aligned to the objective for the standard? And are you tracking those results? And all of those could be a video on their own. So we'll probably do some PL on those things this would be a good time to mention if you're not sure what I'm talking about, or if you're struggling with those things. We can set those things up either for when we come back or definitely for next year. I probably need to mention now that this doesn't change with RTI or special education students. These are students that we already know are struggling. So we're placing interventions in place to help them succeed for both RTI and special education. And in order for us to see if the interventions are working, we need to assess and see. So we give formative assessments along the way to make sure that the intervention is working. For example, if a student is struggling with reading, they may get an intervention of repeated reading once a day for 10 minutes. And in order for us to see if that's working, we do running records every 2 weeks and we measure their improvement. Then we can tell if that intervention is working or not. And if it is working, we're going to continue to do it. And if it's not working, we're going to either change the intervention or change the duration of the intervention, something like that. So I put in here, I'm going to tell you a little secret. This is kind of hard for me to discuss because so many people are tied to spelling tests, but I'm kind of going to talk about them for a minute. I look for spelling tests to see about assessment, either in teacher observation or on lesson plans. And I feel like I can tell a lot about a teacher when they're giving spelling tests. And it has everything to do with what we just discussed. If a teacher gives a spelling test and it matches the standards or objective, or if it's part of the big picture, if it's based on a phonics rule, or if it's based on a spelling rule like I before E, and if the teacher cares about the spelling words the student got wrong the next week or the next month, or even within that year, then the spelling test has been intentional. The spelling test is usually good. If a teacher gives random words or even words with a pattern out on Monday, and then some random assignments where they don't teach if it's just part of group work, and then gives a test on Friday, and then never looks at those words again, then the assessment was not an intentional one. And that's just a grade for the grade book. I believe that grades should be about the standard, and that's probably a whole nother video. So finally, I'm going to leave you with this. Are you being intentional about finding and or creating assessments? And are your assessments rigorous enough to show mastery of the standards? Those two things, if those two things are in order, then you're doing great in this standard. If you feel like you could improve in this area, then just think about some of the things I've said. I think this standard is really important. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about how to use those standards, or if you're using the standards to impact instruction. That'll probably be a shorter video. And again, I'm thinking about you guys, missing you. Can't wait till they open up the building and we can see each other again. But until then, thanks and have a great day.